For those who I may not know or who may not know me, I am Vince Jackson, the Executive Director of the Greater Northampton Chamber of Commerce. And Link&Learn is our educational programming series that we offer through the Greater Northampton Chamber. And we're so fortunate to have this series be sponsored by Florence Bank, which makes it absolutely free to not just the chamber members or investors, but to our entire community. They believe that when the community is well informed, that we're all in a much better place. So we just appreciate Florence Bank for their sponsorship so that we can bring these kinds of programs to you. And also, we can't thank our presenter today, Dan Britton of ReVision Energy, enough for his expertise and offering that, and their services to this community. So with that, Katie, I will allow you to tell us what's next.
Well, ReVision has become a very active partner. Lydia is somebody who I'm sure that you've all met at different events of ours. And as we started building what would be best for them as investors, this is sort of something that came up, and it became clear that the preference was to have Dan lead the charge on the education piece. Is there anything you'd like to add, Lydia, as we head into it?
No, I think that pretty much sums it up. We're excited to dig in.
Fantastic. All right, Dan, you got the floor.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about understanding our electric bills, which can be a little overwhelming. And depending on, how much you all want to get into the weeds, we can go as deep into it or as not, but I'm going to try to at least give you a few takeaways. Before I start, I'll start sharing my screen. It would be helpful to know what your business is, or especially what utility you're in, Eversource or National Grid, and what rate you're on. So if you happen to know if you're on a G1 rate, or maybe you might even be on an R1 rate in a business, I've seen that before. If you happen to know any of that, you're willing to put it into the chat, that would be useful. Let me see here. Okay. So everybody can see my slides, correct? Good. All right. So this is going to focus on small businesses. So there's a lot of different electric rates that apply to larger commercial operations that we're not going to get into. So this is really going to apply to small businesses, but also a lot of overlap with residential electric bills as well. So a couple, sort of the highlights of what I'm going to talk about. Supply versus delivery rates. I think most people have a handle on that. The supply and delivery and the competitive supplier thing. Most people are aware of that. If not, you will be after this. Demand charges. So small commercial rates come in a couple different flavors, at least with Eversource. And so we're going to talk about demand charges, what that's all about. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about net metering and how solar works with billing and that side of it. First, sort of the obligatory stuff about ReVision. We are throughout New England, Massachusetts, our office is in Westfield. We install solar, EV chargers, battery systems, heat pumps, and I think we're coming up on 20,000 installations at this point throughout the Northeast. So what is a kilowatt hour? Most people I talk to, unless they happen to be an electrical engineer, do not really grasp what a kilowatt hour is. And it's sort of increasing. If you want to understand your electric bill, it is sort of essential. And it's increasingly important as we electrify, with everything, especially electric cars, because you're not, putting gallons of gas in your car anymore. You're putting kilowatt hours of electricity in your car. And so a kilowatt hour there's a distinction between kWh, kilowatt hour, and kW power. And so you'll see the two, and people will often use them back and forth. They are two different things. So kW power, kWh, kilowatt hours is energy. And so you can think of kilowatt hours. Here's a few examples of what a single kilowatt hour, or what some things would use a single kilowatt hour. A window air conditioning unit is a good one to think about because most people are familiar with it. Most of those units will use something like 1,000 watts of power. So that's how much instantaneous power they're using for 1 kW of power. And if you let that run for 1 hour, it's going to use 1 kilowatt hour of energy. If it ran for 3 hours, it would use 3 kilowatt hours of energy. And so there's a power rating for any electrical piece of equipment, and then how long it's running ultimately tells you how much energy it's using. Most of our electric bills, as we're going to take a look at, Eversource and National Grid are billing us in kilowatt hours, kWh. The demand charges are in kW because they're billing based on power. We're going to talk about that in a second, but just for now, we're only talking about kilowatt hours energy. And so this is a typical Eversource bill. This one's a small commercial. This is their sample bill off their website. So it's not like this is the customer bill. But this is typical in that it applies to also commercial and residential. So it's pretty much the same thing with the G1 non-demand rate. So first part, on every bill, there is a table that shows how many kilowatt hours of energy you've used over the last 12 months. We use this to size solar arrays, so we can get an idea of how many kilowatt hours a building is using on an annual basis. You can add this up in 10,000 kilowatt hours a year, and then we can size our solar array appropriately. And you can also use this to sort of compare what you're using month to month. In most cases, it's higher in the summer with air conditioning. The other big chunk of the bill is this supply section, which this is basically the actual generation of electricity coming into the utility grid. So, there's a power plant somewhere that is putting that electricity into the grid, and that's what this is all about. A few years ago now, there was the so-called deregulation where the supply and the delivery section got separated. So now you can choose a different supplier that is not necessarily Eversource or National Grid. And we'll talk about that in a second. National Grid and Eversource, they say they don't make any money off of the supply side of the thing. That's not really their business. Their business is the delivery section, getting that electricity to our homes and businesses and maintaining the grid that comes with it. All the the transformers, all the wires, substations. A couple things to highlight on the delivery section of the bill. One, there is always a customer charge that is going to be a fixed fee, and so if you didn't use any electricity for the month, you are just going to get a bill. In the residential is $10 a month. I think the commercial one is up to $20 a month now. But that fee is fixed, and that is just what it costs to have a meter on the side of your house or building. The other big fees in this are the distribution charge and the transmission charge. The distribution charge is the one that is basically the transformers, the wiring, all that stuff that the infrastructure that needs to get the energy to your house. The transmission charge, the other big one is the power, high tension power lines. Actually long distance transmission of electricity from the power plants, substations. There's a whole bunch of other charges on there that are somewhat irrelevant there, but they do fund the mass save energy efficiency programs. So if you haven't taken advantage of those for your home or your business, you certainly should, because we're all putting money into those. And the idea is we all benefit by saving energy in funding those programs. And then sometimes you'll see like vegetation management fees in there. They basically put all the fees that they possibly can in that to show I guess to explain them what's going on. the solar, like the renewable energy charges in there. There's also funding for renewable energy programs, whether it's solar or wind or other things. So that's kind of what all that other stuff is. You don't really have any control over the delivery side. This kind of is what it is. But on the supply side, you do have some control in that you can now choose a competitive supplier. And this goes for both homes and businesses. If you have not been to this website, energyswitchmass.gov, this is how you can actually switch, and you can shop it around. A couple caveats with the alternative suppliers. So first, it's important to keep in mind that the actual supply side of the bill does vary month to month. And so you'll basically, the basic service that you get from Eversource or National Grid, there's a 6-month window that they basically fix the price at. So even though that there are monthly variations, they basically give you a 6-month fixed window so that in this case, you'll be paying 13.4 cents for the supply. The alternative suppliers are sort of constantly changing their rates around. So it really depends on how much time and energy you want to spend messing with this and trying to save a few bucks. Sometimes it can be a few bucks, and sometimes it can be a few $100. It all depends on what the basic service rates happen to be at the time and how that compares to the alternative suppliers. And it also depends on how much electricity you're using. If you're a very low electrical user, then this isn't going to probably, a couple cents isn't going to be very much in terms of dollars. Personally, I will check this website. I try to make a habit of checking this website every time I get an electric bill, so that it's basically like, okay, I got an electric, it just becomes a habit. Then I go and I check that, where supply rates are at. I'm also sort of interested in this, this is the business that I'm in, so I pay attention to it more than the average person. But if you are able and willing, I would recommend checking it on a monthly basis to see what rates are doing. A couple years ago, when Russia invaded Ukraine, a lot of the prices are driven by natural gas markets. So the natural gas market went nuts, and supply rates went through the roof. And the basic service for a period was way high, and some of the competitive suppliers were much lower. So that's a really good example of a time where you could have had like a 10 cents a kilowatt hour savings in some instances during those variations. The rates tend to go up in winter, also tied to natural gas, because natural gas demand goes up in the winter. So the supply rates tend to go up as well. The only other thing I'll say about this is with competitive suppliers is that the devil's in the details. And when you look through the list, you'll see some that don't have a cancellation fee. Some do have a cancellation fee. There's different terms. I never do any of them with cancellation fees because I always want to be able to get out of it without having to pay something. And I will try to do 6 months at a maximum time frame. If you can get long, because that usually is the better rates. The other important thing is you have to pay attention if the 6 month is up and you're locked in at 12.89 cents for 6 months. After the 6 months, direct energy is almost certainly going to increase the rates substantially. So you need to pay attention to when your contract or when your window is open, even if it's not even if there's no cancellation fees. You just have to pay attention to when it's ending and make sure you sign up for a new one or switch back to basic service afterwards. So this whole system was supposed to make electricity cheaper. I think that's, whether or not that's happened, I think is questionable, and it's a bit of a racket, but now it's the game that we have to play, and it just is what it is. All right, that's all I'm going to say about that. So now demand charges. So if you're on a small commercial rate, so this doesn't apply to National Grid. So I should say that up front. If you are a small commercial rate with National Grid, there are no demand charges. If you are a bigger commercial institution with demand charges, it would apply with National Grid. But Eversource has a small commercial demand charge or demand rate and a non-demand rate. And so if you are on the demand rate, this is important and can save you a lot of money. So takeaway one is shopping around for your supply rate, and takeaway two is paying attention if you're on Eversource, whether or not you should be on a demand rate or not. And so to understand demand rates, you have to understand what KW is, the power part of it, not the KWH part. And so the easiest way that I can explain this is to look at an electric car. If anybody drives an electric car, you know that some chargers charge at different rates in terms of actual power. And so a standard level 2 EV charger is typically charging at 5 to 10 kW of power, whereas some of the DC fast chargers can charge at over 100 kW. The higher the kW, the faster the car is going to charge because you're putting more energy, kWh, into the battery quicker. So you can think of kWh as like the equivalent of how many gallons of gasoline you have in the tank, the amount of energy. And then you can think of kW, the power, as how much gasoline is coming out of the pump at any given moment. And so the more gasoline coming out of your pump or the more power coming out of your EV charger, the quicker you're going to fill up your tank. And so that's the fundamental difference between KW and KWH. It's not critical that you understand that, but it is critical that you know that there is a difference and are paying attention to that. Because if your bill looks like this one, which is an Eversource G1 rate with demand charges, you'll notice that some of the line items in the distribution or the delivery side of it are not multiplied by a number of kWh, but they're multiplied by kW. So they're actually billing you based on your peak power for any 15-minute interval in that billing period. So you could use very little electricity, total energy for the month, but if you fire up some heavy electrical load for just 15 minutes, your bill could actually be very high with the demand charge or demand rate. So which one is better kind of depends on what your scenario is. And so I did and one other, on the second page of the bill, there's this chart that kind of shows you what your demand profile is over the last month. And that can be useful because typically the demand charge, people's peak power usage will be higher in the summer, especially if it's just an office building because they're cranking their air conditioners. And those are typically the biggest load for just the standard office. If you're doing any kind of manufacturing, that's a whole different story. But so where this gets a little interesting is that you can look at a couple, so as I mentioned, you can be on, Eversource has a non-demand small commercial G1 rate, and then they have a demand rate version of that. And a couple years ago, they changed it. It used to be that they didn't have this option that you could switch, but a couple years ago that changed, and they didn't tell anybody about this, of course. They just keep billing everybody like normal. But in some cases, you can actually save a lot of money by switching to the non-demand rate. It all depends a little bit on what how you're using, what your demand profile is versus what your energy profile is. But here's a couple examples. In this case, if your demand is 20 kW, peak demand for the month is 20 kW, and you're using about 3,000 kilowatt hours a month. Oh, Joe's from Unitil. I'm leaving. I've left out Unitil, so I apologize, Joe. This is similar to Unitil. Unitil is also an investor-owned utility, so it's similar. I don't deal with Unitil too much because I'm in Western Mass. But anyway, KW and KWH. In this case, on a demand rate, this profile is about $1,000. The bill's about $1,000. If it was on a non-demand rate, it would be about $300 cheaper. So if I saw this customer's bill, I'd recommend that they call up Eversource and tell them that they want to switch to the non-demand rate because they could save $300 a month just doing that. In another situation where the kilowatt hour usage is the 3,000 kilowatt hours, but your demand is only 3 kW, it's actually the reverse. where, you'd save, 150 bucks. You'd be 150 bucks better off being on the demand rate because the demand is actually very low in this case. So it always depends. Generally speaking, most places I've seen are better off on the non-demand rate, but I have a spreadsheet that I put together that tells you, calculates this. So if you want to send me your electric bill, I'd be happy to plug the numbers in and give you some sense of what you're better off. But again, this only applies to Eversource, National Grid, under 100 kW, under 10,000 kilowatt hours a month. You're automatically going to be on non-demand rate. I don't actually know about Unitil, but I guess it's. So net metering and what your bill looks like with solar. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I realize what I just said is a lot of information, and this is also a lot of information. So I'm going to keep it to the sort of the basics here, which essentially you can think of. So if you're not familiar already, behind the meter solar. So if we have a rooftop solar, ground mounted solar, whatever, there's solar on the building or the roof. It's tied in behind the meter of the building, and the electricity from that system is, if the sun is shining, electricity from that system is flowing into the building first. If there's demand there, it gets used on site. And then if there's any excess production, it actually goes back out into the grid. And then the buildings, adjacent buildings are actually using that electricity. So there's this, and then vice versa. If the electricity, if the solar array is not producing enough to supply what's going on in the building, just pulls from the grid. So there's this constant flow going in and out of the grid. The way it works with the billing is that it's basically all on a monthly basis. And National Grid and Eversource and Unitil are just reading the meter at the end of the month and saying, okay, you've imported this much and you've exported this much, and then they bill you for the difference. So in this example bill, there was a net export, so the system fed more electricity into the grid than it consumed, and it had a net export of 277 kilowatt hours. And in this case, it generated a credit for this month of $65. And they had a previous credit, so it was adding on. So in this case, now they have a $660 credit on their bill that they're carrying forward to the next month. And with solar, this is pretty typical, especially in the shoulder months, like right now, when the electrical usage is relatively low, but there's a lot of sunshine, and the system is typically overproducing. And then people will carry this forward into the next month, often into the winter months, and then use up those credits. The net metering credits that you're getting are basically anything that you're using behind the meter directly. You realize full avoided costs, so all of the fees on the bill, it's basically 100% savings. For the export, any monthly net export, that is credited at this formula here: basic supply, the sum of the basic supply rate, distribution, transmission, and transition charges. This is a statutory thing that is required. So this is what it's typically 90%, 95% of the full retail rate. But that can vary a little bit. So if you have an alternative supplier that's actually paying less than, that is less than basic supplies, in some cases, your net metering credit can actually be more to export it, which is a bit of a quirk, but that does happen. But suffice it to say, generally speaking, you don't really need to think about when you're using electricity or what time of the day, what time, or trying to use more in the day and less at night. None of that really matters with net metering on a monthly basis. One thing that has just changed for the better is that we can now, across the board, whether it's a single phase or 3-phase electric service, we can do up to 25 kW AC solar on a residential or commercial service and get 100% net metering. If you go above that, you get 60% net metering, so 60% of the sum of this stuff for any monthly net export. that's a little bit more into the weeds, but that's been a big change because now we're able to do bigger systems to get full net metering benefits. Here, this page is got some good links on it that hopefully this can be made available to the group and you can reference these links. If not, you can take a screenshot of this, but this is that alternative supplier website I mentioned. This is the summary of current Western Mass electric rates. This is National Grid summary of rates. And then if you really want to get into the weeds on net metering policy in Massachusetts, this website, mass.gov website has all that information. It's pretty confusing. Net metering policy in Massachusetts is absurdly complicated. I think that's all I'm going to go over. So if there are questions, I am happy to take them, whether they are in the chat or over audio. Anybody?
I have a quick question. What's the relationship between, like, when a town says that it's switching its supplier? Like, I feel like Northampton just did that. Like, what is the relationship between what slide you showed and that when towns do that?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. I should have brought that up. So if you probably are aware, some towns have done these aggregation things where basically the towns are negotiating, or a group of towns are negotiating with those competitive suppliers to get people in their town a better rate for the supply. And those are great. That's a great way to do it because then it takes the burden off of the rate bearer, the people paying the bills, to have to constantly be checking the supply rate. So the towns are then sort of doing the negotiating for the consumer, which is a great approach, and they can often get better rates. Yeah.
With that too, because the way I look. Dan, Joe at Unitil, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. So my question, and I'm trying to wrap my head around this. I work mostly in New Hampshire, as you alluded to. Unitil's got a little sliver of our Massachusetts, the Massachusetts grid as well. You just went over this. Below 25 kW, it's a 1-to-1 net metering credit. Is that the gist? You get 100% the value of all of those components?
Correct. And that's in Massachusetts, so I can't speak for.
Agreed.
Yeah. I'd have to ask my counterparts in New Hampshire what the policy is there, but yes, that's correct. So if you're under 25 kW AC, you are what they call they're calling a nameplate cap exempt facility, and you get 100% net metering, meaning any of your monthly export is credited at the sum of the basic service supply rate plus transmission, transition, and transition charges. Or did I say no? I said that wrong. Distribution, transition, transmission.
Yep. No,
Yeah.
you had it on the slide, and that all makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool. In New Hampshire, it's similar, a little less. Like we're not focused on New Hampshire right now. You can, if you Google it, the PUC or Department of Energy in New Hampshire has a good slide that summarizes NEM 1.0 and NEM 2.0 in New Hampshire. But in Massachusetts, here's my question. With that, is there when I look at that, I'm like, okay, so there's very little reason to install storage with a system today. If you're getting 100% of the value, no matter when it's exported, you from that, if you're someone who's looking at storage, maybe you want it for backup power, maybe you want it to participate in, other regional, retail demand response or wholesale demand response aggregation programs. But if you're getting 100% credit for all the energy, you shouldn't be installing storage. Is that a fair statement?
Yes. So until we have time of use rates, and unless you're, time of use rates, the storage doesn't really impact the electric bill at all.
Yes.
Trying to address demand charges with battery storage is also pretty tricky, depending on what the demand profile is. But that, you have to have a pretty sizable battery system to make that work. The financial incentive, primarily in Massachusetts anyway, on the small scale, is with battery storage, is the demand response programs like Connected Solutions. And if, people want, I can explain that in detail, but basically, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, makes sense. Wanted to make sure I wasn't missing something, and that makes sense. Good.
I had a question.
Sure.
So I have solar on my house that does like 75% of my total usage. But then my partner lives down the street and we're gonna put solar on his house. And he's got enough roof space we could put extra panels on there. What's involved in like designating the extra power to be then credited to another household?
Yeah, so there's just paperwork essentially. There are some rules about it, but so you in Massachusetts, you are able to assign excess net metering credits, newly generated excess net metering credits to another account. However, it needs to be the same utility,
Mhm.
on the residential side. It needs to be the same utility. It needs to be the same load zone. So if you were in Western Mass and both houses are in Eversource, then it should be no problem. There's a form called the Schedule Z that
Mhm.
you need to fill out with utility, and it's just a matter of putting the right account numbers and what percentage of the credits you want to switch to the other one.
And but you would have to kind of estimate that ahead of time, I guess, like what somebody's going to use versus what might not get used.
You can change that form a couple times per year. So usually I recommend people like set it up, do your best guess of what you think, and then
Mhm.
check it again in a year, and then make any adjustments from there.
Okay, if you ever do, like, so my sister and on her house, she put a bunch of panels on and then she was able to use it, designate it to her business, but then somehow that's was not allowed anymore. Now they have this big credit of money. Can you ever cash that in?
Uh, well, I don't know the details of why they wouldn't let them transfer them to the business. I don't know unless it's a different load zone or a different utility. That's the only rules that I'm aware of, that you're not allowed to transfer them.
Mhm.
But as far as the credit goes, the utilities are not obligated to write you a check for those credits under any circumstance. If you close out your account, they like if you're moving or something, you can do a one-time transfer of the balance to wherever wherever you're moving to. But I think it still does need to be the same utility. But you could move it to a friend or a family's house, from what I understand. But you're never going to they're never going to write you a check for those net metering credits. That's what it comes
Mhm.
down to. It's use it or lose it, essentially.
Yeah. I think the thing that turned me off about is that you have to estimate it yourself. It's not automatically like, oh, the one household used this much, then automatically the overage is going to go to the next house.
Yeah, well, the solar installer should be able to do that for you. So, I
Yeah.
mean, I do that on a regular basis where I'm looking at two different electric bills and then trying to figure out, okay, the system's going to do this monthly. What percentage should we be transferring over to,
Mhm.
to cover that other bill?
Okay. Yeah, we're using ReVision to do this new system, so that's why I tuned in today. But thank you.
Well, who are you working with? On that?
We started off with Malcolm and then
Okay.
Rachel and now Steph is involved because Rachel was out of town, I think.
Okay. Well, yeah, Malcolm should certainly be able to do that. Matt.
Yeah.
Uh,
We
if he
haven't
has-
got to that point yet, but
Okay.
we're getting there.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Yep. Thank you.
I got a question. So with the website that you showed that for the supplier switch, what's the process to switch over? And also, what's the process to like switch back if I wanted to go back to Eversource afterwards?
Yeah. So basically going to that website, clicking on the whichever one you want, and then you're going to need to put your account info in there, meter number, account number, all that. They're going to want a bunch of that stuff.
Okay.
If you ever decide, okay, I rates have gone down, I want to go back to basic fixed service with Eversource or National Grid, it's usually just a phone call to them, and they can make the switch. You usually need to notify. I'm trying to think if I've ever canceled. I've only ever signed up for a new one And then when you sign up for the new one, it sort of automatically kicks you off the old one. I did actually know I switched back to basic service once, and I did have to call. I had to call Eversource to do that. I think.
Okay.
You can also usually cancel directly with the alternative supplier.
So because with Eversource, it sounds like if I switch to a different provider, I don't have to call them to cancel with Eversource. They'll somehow do it.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I mean, I'm guessing it wouldn't be a huge difference for me to justify doing it based on what you were showing in the examples, but who knows? It's worth looking into. So
Yeah, if you're using 1,000 kilowatt hours a month at 3 cents a kilowatt hour or something, that's $30 a month, or somewhere in that range. So
yeah.
not nothing. Right? Did I do that math right? I think so. Anyway, it doesn't certainly it doesn't hurt to be shopping around. That's for sure.
Awesome. Thanks.
So if a municipality has negotiated good rates and there's, citywide demand that helps keep those rates low, is it often the case that you can find something more competitive out there?
In a couple instances, I have seen the community aggregation rates slightly higher than what some of the alternative suppliers are offering. But that's pretty rare. So generally speaking, the community aggregation rates, it depends on when the community aggregation rates were negotiated. That's another big part of it. And as far as I know, there's I live in Southampton, and we don't have that option. But I don't know. I don't see any reason why you couldn't switch to an alternative supplier, even if you've already signed up to with the town aggregation. I don't know if there are any obligations at that point. I doubt it.
Dan, we had a question in the chat. Sorry, this is Jack from the chamber, by the way. We had a question in the chat about whether or not you would be sharing the presentation for people to check out afterward.
Yeah, definitely. I'm happy to do that.
Great. That would be wonderful. Also, side note, is your background a ReVision Energy project?
Yeah.
It looks so much like my in-laws' backyard. I'm wondering if it's in West Hampton.
No, I think this one's actually in Cummington.
Okay.
But yeah, they don't look all that much different.
Yeah. Well, they have been over the moon about their solar installation. It's just been such a great experience for them, from the setup and the installation to all of the credits back now. They go through a lot of electricity there, and it's really made a difference for them.
Yeah, it works. I mean, once we get through all the hurdles with permitting and interconnection and all that, and it's up and running, the vast majority of people are pretty thrilled with the result.
I do wonder if you could give us a sense of if there's a tipping point for a homeowner. So for instance, my in-laws have an installation much like on your screen there, where they have a lot of space in their backyard. But someone like me, I live in a more congested area of Greenfield where my neighbors are close. I don't have a ton of roof space. And I'm wondering if you could just talk about how that gets decided when you start a project, whether or not someone has enough room to make it worthwhile.
Yeah. So the first part of it is to take a look at that part of the electric bill that shows the last 12 months of usage history, and to get some sense of how big of a system we actually need. Then the other question that comes with that is, what are your future plans for electrification? Are you planning to put in heat pumps? Are you planning to get an electric car? And then we try to, take that into consideration. As we were talking about earlier, it generally doesn't make sense to oversize the system unless you have plans to use that electricity, or be able to send the credits to another account, because, as we mentioned, Eversource and National Grid aren't going to be writing checks for any of those extra credits. So sizing is important. if the roof is able to accommodate that size, a roof mounted system is always going to be the most economical approach, assuming that the roof is in good condition and it's got 20 plus years of life left on it. If you've got the space to do it, then and you needing a bigger, or the roof is not viable for some reason, a ground mount is a great alternative. There are a couple advantages. We can put the system in an ideal location. If you've got the space, you don't have to worry about the roof. But they're a bigger, it's a bigger project typically because we're, now building a structure, trenching out to wherever it is. And it's just a more involved project to do a ground mount. There are, setback requirements depending on the town and, the zoning of where the property is. So, if you're in a really tight part of Greenfield in downtown, it might be a challenge to get it approved in terms of setbacks. But, if you're out in the country, you got more bigger property, then, a ground mount might be a very feasible option. So every situation is different. It's sort of case by case, and looking at all the details there.
Dan, I had a question about, you had mentioned electric cars, what that looks like. I would imagine that now you're encountering homeowners and business owners who need to be able to charge, but maybe have not had any experience with solar until they've gone out and bought a car that they need to sort of charge up in a different way. What is that process? How much power does a car typically take? Like, what does it look like for businesses to put in parking spaces along those lines, and homeowners? It's something that I'm very much not familiar with because I haven't done the research. But, at some point, I think more and more people are leaning in that direction.
Yeah. So there's, putting the EV charger at a home is one thing, and that's relatively simple depending on where you live. And I should say, solar and EV chargers are completely separate. They complement each other nicely because if you've got solar and an EV charger, you're essentially, paying for your fuel with the solar. But there's no reason that you can't buy an EV and put an EV charger without solar on your home.
Okay.
Yeah, on a residence, it's relatively straightforward as long as you've got a 2-volt, 240-volt circuit that you can use for the EV charger. And yeah, it's like basically a dryer outlet essentially that you're installing with, and then the charger that comes with it. The commercial chargers at a business get a little bit different. And there are some incentives through the utilities to put those in. But usually those are more the ones that we typically put in are like the charge point stations, where you can set them in all various ways, where you need an app to access it. And then you can set the charging rates. So Northampton, for example, there's the charge point stations, in various locations in Northampton, and up until recently they were free, and so anybody can plug into them. And that was kind of like get people familiar with them, I guess. But now they've switched it so you've got to pay to use them. And so that's ultimately up to the host site to put those in. And depending on the incentives, they do need to be publicly accessible. If you get the utility incentives, the idea is that these are not just for private use, but they would get the utility incentive that the public can use them. But there are kind of ways to get around to discourage setting the rates in different ways to discourage the heavy public use.
I feel like a lot of businesses, it seems to go hand in hand with solar and EV charging. And it seems to be like a package situation. If they don't have it already, they're looking to make it happen in both ways. So that's why I was curious. Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions?
I don't see anything in the chat. It looks like we'll be able to share the deck of your presentation with the folks who have attended.
Yeah.
Right. Oh.
Yeah, well, thanks for the questions and thanks for joining. And I, like, as I said, if you are on an Eversource demand rate, this group is relatively small, so I'm okay saying this. If you want to send me an electric bill, if you're on an Eversource demand rate, G1 demand rate, and you want me to plug your numbers into my calculator and do the comparison, if you'd be better on the non-demand rate, I'm happy to do that. It takes me 5 minutes or something. And my email is in the slide deck, so you'll see it.
It's very generous of you to offer. Thank you.
I get a kick out of looking at electric bills. I always learn something looking at electric bills.
So you're not like us where we open it at home or in our business and just start sweating?
Well, I'm not paying.
Well, let me say thanks again to ReVision Energy. Thank you, Dan, for this insightful presentation. I think now those of us here will, once we do get our bill, will understand it more and at least pay attention to it. Just so you know, one of the pain points that the Massachusetts Retail Association will be taking up on the advocacy front on behalf of small businesses is to push the Massachusetts legislature to do something about all the fixed customer fees, because it's one of those costs of doing business in Massachusetts that is driving people away. I mean, some small business like, gosh, my electric bills are through the roof. And the Massachusetts Retail Association says that that's one of the things that the state has done to itself that's harmed small businesses. So you will be hearing more from that, and the chamber, of course, works hand in hand with all the associations, retail, restaurants, what have you. But the Retail Association at the state level will be working very hard on advocacy concerns to get energy costs down statewide. So more to come. Stay tuned. So again, thanks everyone, and thanks again to Florence Bank for making this all possible. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon.